In this video, we'll cover Spring Data REST and Spring Boot. Earlier, we saw the magic of Spring Data JPA, right? So we had our entity type of employee and our primary key of integer. We plugged it in, and it will give us those methods for free for finding, saving, deleting, and so on. And this really helped to eliminate the boilerplate codes. And we saw this little diagram earlier, right? The coding before Spring Data JPA and the coding after Spring Data JPA. Made it really easy, no implementation class, pretty awesome. And I wonder can this same thing apply to REST APIs? I wonder. So here's the problem. We saw to create a REST API for employee, we would set up our employee REST controller, inject a service, set up the get mappings, post mappings, and so on. We'd set up our service interface, our service implementation. And then we also had our application architecture. We had our REST controller, our service, our repository, and that worked fine and all. But what if I needed to create a REST API for another entity like customer, student, product, or book? Would I have to go back and repeat all of the same code again? And I don't want to do that over and over again for each entity. I wish we could tell Spring, hey, create a REST API for me. Use my existing JPA repository, my entity and primary key, and give me all of the basic REST API CRUD features for free. So Spring Data REST is the solution. It's a separate Spring project. You can use it with regular Spring or Spring Boot. It leverages your existing JPA repository, and Spring will give you a REST CRUD implementation for free. And the nice thing here is that it helps to minimize boilerplate REST code. And in fact, there's no new coding required to get set up with this Spring Data REST. So Spring Data REST will expose these endpoints for free. So you'll have methods for posting to create a new employee, get to retrieve, put for update, and delete for, of course, deleting an existing employee. And you get all of these REST endpoints for free when you make use of Spring Data REST. And again, just like magic. So you may wonder, how does it work in the background? Well, Spring Data REST will actually scan your project for JPA repository sub-interfaces. It'll expose the REST API for each entity type for your JPA repository. So in this example here, I have this employee repository, extends JPA repository. We have this entity type of employee. It'll actually expose an employee's endpoint. So a bit more on the endpoint here. So it'll create the endpoints based on an entity type, and it'll make use of the simple pluralized form, meaning it'll take the first character of the entity type as lowercase, and then it'll simply add an S to the end of the entity. So in this case, we have this employee repository. The entity type is employee in brackets, and then it'll create a /employees endpoint. All right, and so that's the basic approach for how they'll expose these REST endpoints. Now, I'll talk more about the pluralized form later in some later videos, and also how you can kind of customize it. But for now, we'll kind of take this out of the box. All right, so let's look at the actual development process. So for the first step is add in the Spring Data REST to your Maven POM file, and that's it. There's absolutely no coding required. You simply make a Maven POM entry, and you get these endpoints for free. So a bit more here on step one is adding it to your POM file. So you simply give a dependency here, and you give a reference for Spring Boot Starter Data REST. And that's it. No coding required. Spring Data REST will scan for JPA repositories and expose endpoints. And so you'll get these endpoints for free based on the various entity types in your JPA repositories. So for Spring Data REST, you only need 3 items. You need your entity type of employee, the JPA repository, and then also the Maven POM dependency for Spring Boot Starter Data REST. So the first 2 items, we already have those. The only new item here is number 3, the Maven POM dependency. And then that's it. Now, some changes to our application architecture here. So before, we had our employee REST controller, we had our employee service and our repository on the back end. And now after we're using Spring Data REST, they'll give us a /employees endpoint for free. So there's no additional coding required to get this given REST endpoint. So in our original architecture up top, we can delete the code from our employee REST controller and also delete the employee service. We no longer need that code because Spring Data REST will provide that functionality for us for free. And I like free stuff. Now with minimizing the boilerplate code, so before Spring Data REST, we had our REST controller, we had our employee service, we had our service implementation. So about 3 files and 100+ lines of code. And then after Spring Data REST, you're going to love this, right? No coding required. Just give a Maven POM entry. Spring Data REST will scan for those repositories and automatically expose those endpoints for free. You can easily see that we no longer need the original code on the left-hand side because Spring Data REST will give us all of that functionality for free. The Spring Data REST endpoints are Helios compliant. So what is Helios? It's the hypermedia as the engine of application state. Blah, big acronym. Basically hypermedia driven sites that provide information to access our REST interfaces. And so really you can just think of this as metadata for the REST data that's coming back from these given REST APIs. You can read more about Helios at this link here at spring.io, but I'll actually go through some quick examples to show you the basics of how this Helios works. Spring Data REST responses make use of Helios. So for example, a REST response from get employee 3 to get a single employee, then it'll return this JSON data as a response. So up top, we'll actually have our content or our real data, like our employee data, first name, last name, email for a given employee. And then at the bottom, we actually have response metadata. So this metadata here basically has links to the actual entry or the data. So this is for employee ID of number 3, just a way of describing the data or linking to the data. Now for a collection, the metadata includes the page size, the total number of elements, the pages, and so on. So if I wanted to get a list of employees by doing a get/employees, then the JSON response will be this piece of information here. And up top, we have an embedded, a JSON array of employees for all the different employees there. And then down at the bottom, we have metadata about the page or information about the page. So the size of the page, the total number of elements, pages, number, and so on. And I'll talk more about configuring the page sizes a little bit later. So for details on Helios, see the link here at spring.io. Helios also makes use of the Hypertext Application Language Data Format, or HAL, and that's the actual format of the JSON data that's being returned in the response. So if you'd like to get more information on HAL, you can see the link here at the Wikipedia website. Spring Data REST also has some advanced features. So there's support for pagination, sorting, and searching. You can also extend and add custom queries with JPQL. You can also customize the REST API by making use of the query domain specific language or the query DSL. For more information, you can see the link here at spring.io, Spring Data REST.